Well, we live in the strangest of timelines because it now seems that a streaming service that used to send DVDs to our home is about to own a film studio. But a lot of people online are basically saying this is the death of cinema. And having just made 2 videos where I kind of argued that that's not happening, I have to kind of address this and say, like, is this the death of cinema? I don't really think that it is. However, I do completely understand why people are freaking out over this. It is a big deal, figuratively and literally, but it's not so much the deal because media conglomerates buying and selling parts of their company and acquiring other companies, like, this is pretty normal. I think what is abnormal is the fact that it's Netflix. I think people would not be freaking out if it was literally any other company, but this does kind of feel like some people have described this as like the finale of a TV show where like, it's all just coming into place and Netflix is the winner. The streaming wars are over. And that might be true, but I don't even know if that's true because there's still a lot out there between YouTube and TikTok. I mean, I don't think the streaming wars are necessarily over, but I suppose if this deal goes through, there's an argument to be made for this massive consolidation being a final nail in the coffin, so to speak. But I don't really think that we're there yet. I don't think the sky is falling. I have looked at this from a couple of different angles. So over the last week, giving myself the chance to sort of check out all the different perspectives and talking to some of my friends who work in the industry, because I do have some friends who work in the industry, I completely understand why people are freaking out about this. It's not a small thing that's happening. And so I kind of want to go through why I think some of this might be overblown, and I don't actually think that this is going to kill the cinema. But I do want to clarify a few things because, some of this is a little bit concerning. The reason why people are so particularly upset that Netflix is doing this is because Netflix is not like a typical film studio. Overall, I think Netflix has had a generally hostile attitude towards the industry, and the feeling is mutual. But more importantly, I think there's a trust issue. I think the industry doesn't trust Netflix because of all that hostility and because of a lot of mixed messages that it's put out over the years. In fact, I think that there's a quote from Sarandos about saying that the cinema is outdated, which is kind of insulting. And I completely understand why people would be like, we don't want Netflix to own a film studio because they will just ruin it. So I think the concerns are warranted. Netflix kind of became the villain in the writer's strike. Like, the writer's strike was basically emerged out of a need to protect writers and filmmakers in the industry from being exploited and from winding up in an industry where it's almost impossible to make a living. And I'm very sympathetic to that argument. Like, if you're telling writers that the best they can hope for is to participate in this incredibly cutthroat process of getting into a very, very small writer's room for a series that is only going to have 6 to 8 episodes a season, or 10 if you're lucky, and maybe get called back when the season returns like a year and a half later, I mean, this is not a way to make a living. As opposed to the old way of doing things that people were used to, where you get hired on for a show that has 24 episodes a season and you're good. Like, you can actually plan for the future. You can buy a house, you can have a family, you can actually kind of make a living doing that. So there's that side of it, but I also think, a good analogy to this problem and why it's so at odds with the market is Walmart. Because Walmart had the same problem where they were offshoring jobs, they were making things overseas, and it was costing a lot of jobs. The company would also come into small towns and sort of put other mom and pop businesses out of business. But on the other hand, they were lowering prices, and consumers were purchasing products at Walmart, and still are, because they offer lower prices. And similarly, I think Netflix is very popular. It's the #1 streaming network right now, so it's very popular. And so I don't think people are going to stop using Netflix as long as it keeps putting out a good product. So the way the industry actually operates is kind of at odds with the output that Netflix is trying to provide customers. And so there's a lot of tension there. And plus, for all accounts, the morale at Netflix is very low. Like, it's a cutthroat company, very unfriendly, very difficult to work for, or so we're told, because of the culture that they have created over there. Great for your bottom line, very efficient, but probably not very good for the people who are actually producing the content. And so I feel like part of why this feels like a gut punch to the industry is it feels like that's the future of the industry. Like, everything's going to be made this way. But I don't think we know that for sure. The future is not written. And certainly if you're going to base all of this off of Netflix, the thing about Netflix that makes it such a competitive company is that it's always changing, often frustratingly so. And they lie repeatedly. Like, they're a bunch of filthy liars over there. They'll come out and say, we're not actually interested in streaming. We're just going to stick to DVDs, but then they go to streaming. Then they say, well, we're just interested in being a catalog. We just want to be a very convenient place for people to come and watch their movies. We're not interested in original programming, but then they go into original programming because they realize that's the future. And so constantly, the company's changing its mind on stuff. Like, it used to be okay with sharing passwords. It actually encouraged it. It allowed people to share passwords. But then they cracked down on that too. And so every single time they say, oh, though we're not about that, they look at the numbers and they're like, actually, we might be. We might be about that, actually. And so when you hear Netflix executives talk about how they have such disdain for the cinema, none of that's written in stone. It doesn't mean that we can't take them at their word and say that they actually don't care about the cinema and that they're never going to release their movies into the cinema ever. But if you look at Netflix's track record, it is a very data-driven company. Everything is based on data. And so I have 4 reasons why I think this is not going to be the death of cinema. So the first reason, I just don't think this deal is going to actually go through. There's 2 ways that this thing will fail. One is on the merits. It is going to go through the court, and David Ellison is going to fight tooth and nail, and he's going to argue that Netflix owning HBO will essentially amount to a monopoly. However, Netflix has a very easy counter argument to that. Netflix's argument is going to be that the main competitor to Netflix is not necessarily Disney and HBO, it's actually YouTube and TikTok. And I think that that's 100% correct. I don't think that Netflix buying HBO will mean that it has a monopoly. It will definitely have more power and influence and more market share, but I definitely don't think that it would be a monopoly. For starters, you have to consider that although Netflix has more subscribers than anybody else, most of those subscribers are not from the US. They supposedly have 300 million subscribers now, but only 81 million of those are in the US. So Netflix is definitely a global brand. So if you're going to make the argument that they have a monopoly, it's kind of a dubious argument, I think. So I don't think the Netflix deal will fail on the merits. If the courts are the only deciding factor in this, then the deal will probably go through. But of course, we know that it's not going to be decided on the merits. It's going to be decided on whether or not our commander-in-chief decides that it can go through. Like, at the end of the day, that's just the time we live in, where the regulators and the executive branch they're not separate at all. Everything's about politics now. So the fact that Susan Rice is on the board of Netflix, eventually someone's going to tell Trump that that's the case, and he's going to be like, I didn't know that. Hell no, this is not going through. And that'll be that. And unfortunately, that's just how it is. I just don't see getting around that at this point. You know, the only flip side to that is, for all we know, maybe Trump will get tired of David Ellison. Maybe he'll think that David Ellison's kind of annoying. You know, if you look at Elon Musk, for example, he kind of lost interest in Elon Musk pretty quickly there. So you never know. It kind of sucks that the future of business, of all kinds of different industries, rests solely on the constantly changing whims of our president, but that is the future we live in. Nevertheless, another factor is the breakup fee, because there is a $5.8 billion breakup fee. So if the deal doesn't go through, if it falls through because of regulatory issues, Netflix has to pay Warner Brothers $5.8 billion. And I've seen some people kind of get this backwards. They think that Netflix is going to get paid either way. Like if the deal falls through, they still get paid. I've heard that before, but that's actually not true. Like this is what the contract actually says. Now, if Warner Brothers ends up deciding to sell to someone else, then they have to pay another fee as well. I think it's like $2.8 billion that they'll have to pay. If they decide to like go with Comcast after the fact, then they'll have to pay Netflix. But if it fails because the government shuts down the deal, then Netflix is on the hook for that. So I can see that being another incentive for a sort of Trump coalition urging the president to kill the deal and just make Netflix eat it. So I just think based on the present politics that we have, that's just where we're at. Because the other factor here is that David Ellison wants not just the movie and television production part, they want all of it. So the part they're trying to spin off into Discovery, which would include CNN, that part is the part that David Ellison wants. And in terms of the politics of that, I think that's what the Trump administration would want too. So that would be just another reason why they would want Paramount to have this thing rather than Netflix. So I just think based on all the different political and economic variables, I just don't see this deal actually going through. But it won't be because of the merits of the case. I think a deal like this, I don't think there's any reason why the regulators would actually have to shoot it down. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. There might be some arguments to be made for why this is an antitrust problem, but I'm not really sure that if it gets struck down that that'll be the reason. Although if it is, that would just be another reason why this deal won't go through. So the second reason is release windows. Everybody's talking about the fact that Ted Sarandos wants to eliminate the release window for theatrical releases or shorten them considerably. However, I don't think that this is the approach they will take. Because like I said, Netflix is a very data-driven company. And so if we can take it on good faith that they will make all of their decisions based on whatever the data says, then I think that we can pretty safely assume that they won't kill theatrical releases for all of their content. Maybe some of it, certainly. But I think Netflix has figured out that certain types of content make more sense on streaming, while certain types of content might make sense theatrically. They might not want to admit this publicly, but theatrical releases do much better on their platform than their own content. And I know that they're looking at their data every single day going, damn, why can't we make something that does better on our own platform than movies that are in theaters? That's got to be super frustrating. And so now if they finally have movies, an actual movie studio with connections in the industry that already knows the way things work and how to get movies into theaters and all of this stuff, I mean, all of those connections will play a role. And so I think once they look at all of it, I just don't see them killing theatrical releases altogether. I just don't see it happening. It would be stupid of them to do that. And if you don't believe me, they've already done some studies into this. So Parrot Analytics did a white paper called Movie Demand in 2022. And so they used COVID as an opportunity to learn about day and date releases and try and learn what are the kinds of movies that make more sense on streaming versus the theater. And what they found was that there are certain movies that do better if you release them in the theaters with a 45-day window versus other movies that make more sense straight to streaming. which is not unusual because, back in the day when VHS came around, same thing. There were certain movies that, based on the production value and the amount of time spent on the movie and just the competition in the marketplace for movies that are in theaters already or slated for release, certain movies just made more sense to either go straight to DVD or VHS, or others are released to television, as a made-for-TV movie or whatever. So this kind of thing is not new, where you're actually crunching the numbers and you're trying to figure out, does it make more sense for this movie to go straight to streaming, or should we go to the theater with this? And like I said, they've already crunched the numbers. Like, sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. So that white paper, for instance, points out that Matrix Revolutions, for instance, was a huge failure. Like, that was a movie that totally missed its opportunity because it was a day and date release. And they look at this on a granular level to figure out how much money did we make here versus how much viewing potential did we get on streaming. And they kind of crunched the numbers to figure out, like, if it was worth it. Did we lose money by not having a wider window for that? And so that's an example of a movie where they completely got it wrong. They should not have done a same day release on that one. And there's other examples on there too. They actually look at Netflix specifically. And yeah, they find out that SVOD, streaming video on demand is what it stands for, or subscription video on demand. These platforms rely on theatrical franchises and hits to remain commercially viable. And again, this was like 3 years ago, so it might be slightly out of date, but I don't think it's that out of date. I think the logic is sound. In order for streaming platforms that need content to survive, they're going to need content that you just have to subscribe to that service to get. And granted, you can get a lot of that with original programming, like Stranger Things is the big hit right now, and yeah, if you want to watch that, you have to subscribe. But if you have a subscription to Netflix, there are some original shows and movies that you're going to watch on there, but mostly, according to the data, you're going to be watching movies that already came out in the theater. And that relates to my third argument for why the sky is not falling, and that's cultural relevance. Because I think Netflix has always struggled with cultural relevance. Even though Netflix does have some programming that makes it into the cultural zeitgeist, like Stranger Things, it is far from being something like HBO. Like, HBO is such a unique brand. Back in the day, its slogan was, "It's not cable, it's HBO." Like, their whole thing was, you're gonna get stuff on HBO that you literally can't get anywhere else. And that often means like more salacious content with more nudity and violence and stuff like that. It's the edgy stuff like that you just can't show on basic cable. But it became something even more than that. It was just a home for the highest quality programming on television. And it still kind of is. Like, if a show gets greenlit to HBO, most of the time, it's just going to be a hit. I mean, they've had flops many times, but like, it's such a prestigious brand. And Netflix is not that. Netflix has so much content that you just, like, most users, when they're watching Netflix content, they binge watch it first of all. So there isn't a whole lot of time for it to be part of the cultural conversation. The main reason why Stranger Things is part of the cultural conversation is because of the awkward release schedule of the last season, where they had to break it up into 2 seasons, or they broke it up into, I think, 4 episodes and then another 4 episodes, which I think was done for production reasons. They didn't actually want to do it that way, but it ended up being good for them. And so they're doing it again with this season. They're doing 4 episodes have already been released of this last season, and then they're going to do another 3 on Christmas, and then they're going to do the finale on New Year's, which is brilliant. Like, that way, that is a way to actually make the show part of the cultural conversation. And so that's something that Netflix is really struggling with. I think they'll get there eventually, but the important thing to keep in mind, though, is that, like I said, most of these movies that people are watching on Netflix are not Netflix original movies. They're movies that appeared in theaters. That could either be that people are tired of the movies that Netflix is putting out, or they just don't want to watch them as much as movies that appeared in the theaters. So of the top 20 movies on Netflix right now, that were streamed this year, only 7 of them were straight to streaming. Everything else was in the theater. Now that's based on a report that came out in July, which is a month after their actual top movie of the year, K-Pop Demon Hunters, came out. And that one's an interesting one because that movie actually was released in theaters as a sing-along, and it was the widest release that Netflix has ever done of a movie that went to Netflix. It was actually put out in 1,700 theaters, and it did pretty well. Like for being a movie that had almost no marketing outside of word of mouth, it did pretty well. I suspect that people at Netflix are looking at that going, I think it's worth it to at least consider theatrical releases for some of our content, because clearly, if we do put it out in theaters, people will go out and see it, and that's just another revenue stream for us. It also, like I said, it creates that cultural relevance, because movies that appear in a theater where actual box office tickets were sold to see that movie in a theater, that in and of itself builds cultural relevance for that movie. They have a relationship with Sony where they have a first look deal with Sony. So whenever Sony's thinking about making something, they show it to Netflix first to see if they want to finance it and distribute it. So that's probably a much better relationship for content making for Netflix. Like Netflix outsources a lot of it anyways to different production companies, but that's an example of them already working with a film studio to produce a movie that eventually shows up in a movie theater. So I suspect that that is a sign of things to come, that if this Netflix deal does go through, I do think that Netflix will eventually start to put their movies in theaters more and more. Now, they probably won't do it to the same extent or maybe in the same way. Like they might have a shorter release window for their movies, depending on what they are. But like I said, if they're making data-driven decisions, they're going to have a different release schedule for different movies depending on what the type of movie is. And at the very least, it can't be any worse than what Warner Brothers is already doing, which is making entire movies and then not releasing them. So no one can watch them. They've already done this multiple times. Like Coyote versus Acme was supposed to be released years ago, and they decided they just weren't going, even though they already made the movie, they just decided they were not going to release it for tax purposes. They wanted to call it a tax write-off. The fact that this is legal. How could it possibly be legal to make an entire movie and then write the entire movie off for legal purposes, for tax purposes? It's just insane. It's offensive to me, to be honest. And they've done it more than once. Apparently they did it with Batgirl too. So I'm just like, okay. On the one hand, you have a studio that makes movies and then doesn't release them. And then you have another company that wants to make movies and only stream them, but maybe occasionally release them in theaters. It's like, I don't know. I don't know that we're losing much there. It's just kind of crazy how the movie industry works. Some of this change, let me put it this way. Some of the changes that are being forced on movie studios and the movie industry writ large are probably needed, because the way the movie industry works to a certain degree just needs to change. In any event, Netflix still does have a problem, and that's the cultural relevance problem. I mean, they actually have a couple of problems. The rising cost of streaming itself. Streaming is not cheap, but I think that cultural relevance thing is a serious problem, because right now, like in the movie theater industry, there have been a bunch of studies like this one, and they find that roughly 2/3 of Americans have been to the movie theater at least once within the last year. That's over 200 million Americans. So that's still a lot. So even though people like to say repeatedly that the movie theater experience itself is dying away, even from a cultural standpoint, like people just don't really think about the movies as much and they don't want to go to the movies, it's just not true. The main problem is, movie theaters need more movies. That seems to be the main issue. And so whoever's going to fix that problem, whether it's going to be the movie studios finally getting off their butts and actually making the kinds of movies that people want to see, or if it's going to be other indie studios like A24 or Neon or whatever coming out with bigger and bigger movies and just becoming the movie studios of the future, whatever needs to happen, I think it's going to happen one way or the other, because I don't think people are going to give up on the cinema that quickly. And so finally, that brings me to the last one, which is that movie theaters are becoming more affordable. That seems counterintuitive, but I actually have a whole video that I am almost done with that I was about to record before this Netflix deal went through, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to put a pause on that, and I'm going to do this Netflix video first. But yeah, I've started researching the data on actually how much do movies cost nowadays, and what are movie chains offering by way of like deals and perks, and you'd be surprised. Like, if you're smart about it, I mean, it would be a lot cheaper to go to the movies than to have 5 or 6 different streaming services and be paying over $120 a month for services that often include ads, and the quality's not that great unless you pay the extra to get the 4K. And even then, you have to pay extra for good internet so you can actually have a high enough bandwidth to stream the good quality content. And that's assuming you have the right equipment, like if you have a good screen, if you have, you know, all that stuff. If you actually count it all up, you know, and that's assuming you don't have cable. Like if you're a cord cutter and you don't have cable, it still gets kind of pricey to have all these different streaming services, which are increasingly making it more difficult and less likely for you to get the movie that you want. Whereas if you go to a theater, you know, if you take advantage of the deals that movie theater chains are offering more and more, I think in the long run, it might actually be cheaper to go to the movies. And I'm going to make that argument. Also, streaming is looking more and more like cable every day. I think eventually it will just be cable. You can already see the writing on the wall. Every streaming service, including Netflix now, is offering live content, including sports, which they're a big bunch of fat, filthy liars over there. They said they were not going to do live content or sports, and now here we are doing special events, and they even did a special Six Kings tennis tournament that I watched. I'm not going to lie, I love tennis, so I logged on to Netflix to watch that because, of course, I'm going to do that. But yeah, over there in Liar Town, they are looking more and more like cable. So I think eventually people are just going to slowly make their way back to the cinema because it is such a unique experience and it's a social experience. And I think people are craving that more and more. And I have data on that as well. So, like I said, I do think that there's cause for concern. I do think that there's a feeling that the movie industry is about to lose control to this company that doesn't seem to have the industry at heart, because it seems like Netflix only seems to be interested in the distribution aspect of what it does and less on the production. Like, they'll do production to the extent that it brings more people to the service and they don't have to pay licensing fees, because that's really the precipitating factor that caused them to go into original production in the first place, was that they knew that eventually everyone's going to want to get into the streaming game, including Disney. And as expected, Disney just pulled everything off of Netflix and they put it on their own service. And eventually everybody started doing that. So Netflix saw the writing on the wall and was like, yeah, I guess we're going to have to make our own stuff because this whole licensing thing is very unpredictable and we're not going to be able to make any money if we are constantly losing the thing that's bringing people onto the platforms, which is all of these big budget releases that appeared in theaters and have all that cultural relevance. And so they were one step ahead on that. So yeah, I'll give Netflix this. They are always one step ahead and they see where things are going. But again, that's why I think them buying a movie studio is kind of prescient. You know, it's them realizing rightly that the cinema is not a competitor to them, but it's actually an asset. If they make movies and they release those movies into theaters and then those movies come to streaming, people will watch those more than if they just make movies for streaming. And that's not to say that they shouldn't continue making content just for streaming, because like I said, that's perfectly fine. You know, a lot of content just doesn't make sense to be on in the theater. I don't really think that we need to have a whole glut of murder documentaries appearing in theaters. I wouldn't be opposed to watching them, but that's probably a better fit for Netflix. You know, I'm not gonna lie. Maybe that's just a me thing, but I mean, I love documentaries, and as far as physical media, that is also another concern. I don't have any data on this, but it seems like people are talking more and more about physical media. Amidst all of the streaming wars, it seems like people are becoming more and more aware of not only how difficult it is to rely on any one service to have a movie that you want to watch, but if you buy a movie, that doesn't necessarily mean that you own it. And so sometimes you might log in to watch the movie that you owned, but the service, Amazon or whoever, just doesn't own it anymore. And so it's just not there anymore. And those stories are also happening more and more. So I think, you know, the desire for physical media is going to start to bubble up again, I think. But I could be totally wrong about that. Like the cinema stuff, I don't think I'm wrong about, but physical media, I don't know as much about. But it seems to me like just the natural progression of things. So we'll see. But as far as the Warner Brothers thing goes, they have a deal with Studio Distribution Services, and that deal was a 10-year deal, and it was signed 5 years ago. So they still have 5 more years on that deal, and so all of the DVDs and Blu-rays of WB movies that are released are distributed by them. And so at least for the time being, there's gonna still be physical media being put out by them, even if this Netflix deal does go through. So as far as Netflix famously doesn't provide physical media for all of its shows, like maybe some of them, like I think you can get Stranger Things on DVD if you want, but like most of them, they just don't even bother with physical media. And so the concern is that is also going to go away. That if Netflix buys Warner Brothers, then all the stuff that Warner Brothers has put out over the years is no longer going to be available on DVD. But we'll see. If the demand continues, as with cinema, then I don't think physical media will necessarily go away. In fact, like I said, I think there are signs that physical media might be making a comeback, but I could be wrong about that. I'm not willing to stake my reputation on that part. But on the cinema, I still think that, even though things are going to be a little bit more touch and go for the next couple of years in the movie industry, if Netflix does in fact go through with this deal, I think that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it may not go the way people think that it will go. So I just think the cinema is such a powerful experience that it's going to take a lot more than one company to kill it. And on that note, I will see you in the next video.